So our final chapter for this semester, yay, is chapter 18. In this chapter, we're going to talk about European power and expansion from the years 1500 to 1750. So a lot of time that we're talking about. And the different sections or the different topics, like big broad topics, are the Protestant and the Catholic Reformations, 17th century crisis and rebuilding, absolutionist states in Western and Central Europe, alternatives to absolutionism, colonial expansion and empire, and the Russian Empire. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Protestant Reformation. And look at the word Protestant. You break it down to protest. So they are protesting something, right? That's where that word Protestant comes from. And so early critics of the church, they focus on absenteeism. And that's when an official of the church would hold several offices without actually visiting the communities. So they could be, your priest at several different parishes, but you only stay to one. You don't go and visit the different communities. They were also, they focused on ignorance and lack of education amongst the clergy, and also the immorality amongst the clergy. One of the biggest critics that we talk about that has this huge following is Martin Luther. And Martin Luther's criticisms and those criticisms of protesting, that's where Protestant comes from, protesting princes, they found support in the atmosphere of criticism. Luther's insistence on faith alone and on the scriptural basis of practice, that was spread by the printing press and through his sermons that were printed and sermons that were picked up and taught elsewhere. And what this does is what Martin Luther is actually doing is he's beginning to threaten the authority of the church. Some northern German princes in the loose confederation of the Holy Roman Empire, they supported his ideas. One, because they didn't have to go to the church for permission anymore if they became Lutheran. So many supported them for spiritual reasons, but a lot of others, they understood that they had economic and political gain in this, and independence from that centralizing authority of church and monarchy. So Lutheran princes were able to confiscate monastery and church lands for economic gain. There's also this sense of German nationalism, and Luther, he uses the phrase like "we Germans" and other phrases that kind of promotes that idea of nationalism. That contributed to the spread of Lutheran thought. Concerns over royal succession led to the establishment of a national church in England, known as the Church of England. Sometimes we refer to it as the Anglican Church, but you'll remember this comes out because of Henry VIII and producing a male heir. And in the Catholic Church, you couldn't divorce. And he's looking for a divorce from his first wife. So he's going to just leave the Catholic Church altogether, establish his own church, make himself the head of the church. And, church officials had to sign an oath loyalty to the monarch as the head of the church, not the Pope anymore in the Church of England. And so this break from Rome, that's, again, accomplished under Henry VIII, who will eventually go through 6 wives, and then reaffirmed under his daughter Elizabeth I. Protestant ideas, they begin to spread to France, England, Scotland, and the Netherlands, and New England over in the colonies in the form of Calvinism. And there's a French reformer, his name is John Calvin, and he taught God's absolute omnipotence, humanity's lack of free will, and the doctrine of predestination. Calvinism became the most active form of international Protestantism. And just to give you an idea of where all these are spreading from, you can see here in yellow, this is the spread of Lutheranism, Calvinism, Reformed Calvinism. The Church of England, of course, is going to become the Church of England. This is still Roman Catholic, spreading out from Rome. And then Eastern Orthodox, Constantinople. And then, of course, the Muslim Empire, kind of a mixture here of Muslim and Eastern Orthodox. In response to the Protestant Reformation, we have the Counter-Reformation. And this is the Catholic Reformation, and it was a response to theology and the spread of Protestantism. Pope Paul II, he established a papal inquisition to investigate and prosecute error among Catholics. A general council of the church met between 1545 and 1563, referred to as the Council of Trent, to work on responses to problems that had led to protest, such as uneducated clergy and absenteeism, and to establish the grounds of the Catholic faith in the face of the new challenges to authority. New orders were established that emphasized the importance of education, such as the Ursuline Order of Nuns that educated women and the Society of Jesus. And founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1540, the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits as they were known, played an important role in spreading education among the clergy and the faithful and in missionizing the globe. The Jesuits, if you will recall, they're eventually going to make their way to the New World and set up missions throughout the New World. There is some religious violence, though, of course, that goes with this when you have these big changes in warfare among the principalities of the Holy Roman Empire that led to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, and that allowed each individual prince to decide between the Catholic and the Lutheran faiths for their territories. Fighting between Catholics and Calvinists in France and the attack on Calvinists by Catholics in 1572, known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, led to 15 years of religious-based civil war in France. Civil war between Calvinists and Catholics in the Spanish Netherlands led to Spanish intervention and Spanish control of the southern Catholic provinces and Calvinist control of the northern provinces. It's kind of going back and forth, right? The northern provinces declared their independence and the United Provinces of the Netherlands in 1581, and Spain will recognize Dutch's independence in 1619. The wars of religion also became a time of unprecedented persecutions for witchcraft. So the social order and peasant life that's coming during the 17th century, in much of Europe, the idea that social life was structured in a hierarchy that reflected God's rule in heaven, known as the Great Chain of Being, that really predominated. The monarch was at the top, the clergy was beneath the monarch, the nobles beneath the clergy, and the rest of society, the majority of the population, fell beneath this social hierarchy. Wealthy merchants might buy their way up to the nobility. Peasants, laborers, and artisans were expected to show deference to their betters. Within this system, a hierarchy based on patriarchy existed as well. So the father is the head of the house, or the oldest male is the head of the home. The vast majority of the population lived in the countryside outside of urban centers. Very few peasants owned enough land to be self-sufficient, with the majority living as tenants or as villages involved in labor or servitude. And then we are going to have some environmental changes that happen that's going to lead to some economic and social crisis. So there's a colder and wetter climate that's going to begin to develop in Europe. Diseases brought on malnutrition and outright starvation, and it weakened the entire population. Agricultural production was disrupted, causing food prices to increase, adding to the suffering of the European population. Many peasants were left unemployed and unable to purchase any manufactured products or food, only adding to this economic decline. The urban poor and peasants were hit hard when the price of bread surpassed their ability to pay, and many frustrated peasants began to riot. Mobs attacked convoys taking the grain into the city markets, and the commitment to maintain order led to increased power and centralization of the state. Then we have the 30 Years' War that breaks out, and we see this conflict between Catholics and Protestants ended under the uneasy truce that came about in 1555. But the truce deteriorated as the Lutheran princes formed the Protestant Union and the Catholics formed the Catholic League. Both groups were determined to stop the other from gaining any advancement. The war was fought in 4 phases. So this is the 30 Years' War that we're talking about. The first phase was the Bohemian Civil War between the Catholic League and the Protestant Union. Second was the Danish phase, when the Protestant king of Denmark witnessed Catholic victories. The third phase was the Swedish phase, as the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus and his army arrived in Germany. And the final phase was prompted by France's Cardinal Richelieu's concern that the Habsburgs would rebound after the death of the Swedish king, and the cardinal declared war on Spain. By the time all 4 phases of the war ended, many forgot what the war had been about in the initial stages. And we have the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War, establishing a turning point in European history. The war had been the most devastating conflict Europe had seen. 1/3 of urban residents and 2/5 of the rural population were dead. Trade had been severely disrupted, and many cities in Germany had been destroyed because of the war. So here's the 30 Years' War for you, kind of the different main parts that the we just talked about on the slide before, where the war is happening and which countries are involved. We do have achievements in state building, though. Yay. So absolutist monarchs gathered power under their personal control. English and Dutch rulers were expected to respect laws passed by a representative form of government. Obstacles slowed the ability of the royal monarch to efficiently rule the far reaches of the empire, and this is going to diminish the willingness for some to follow the directions of a faraway king. It's like, he's too far away, let's do our own thing. Following the 30 Years' War, both absolutist and constitutional governments gained stronger central control. Authority increased in taxation, military development, larger bureaucracies, and the ability to force the population to be obedient. These increasingly centralized and bureaucratic states are referred to as fiscal military states, which harnessed domestic resources to maintain large armies to keep internal order and competed for European and overseas territory. Spain specifically, right? So Spanish trade in the new colonies had declined over the years due to competition from other industries and from Dutch and English traders. The mines that filled the Spanish treasury were beginning to dry up. Spain had a huge problem with debt, and the Spanish currency continued to grow weaker. As manufacturing shrank, the textile industry was destroyed by steep inflation. The Spanish crown had expelled former Muslims, which hurt the Spanish workforce of skilled labor and merchants. Spain was having trouble with internal confrontations and military defeats by the French, so Spanish dominance in Europe had finally come to an end. Henry IV kept France at peace by issuing the Edict of Nantes, which allowed the Huguenots the right to worship throughout France. After his death, though, the Queen Regent headed the government for her eldest son, Louis XIII. Cardinal Richelieu became the first minister of the French crown. He allowed the monarchy to remain in power despite the turmoil of the 30 Years' War. Richelieu designed his domestic policies to strengthen royal control. His foreign policy goal was to destroy the Habsburgs' grip on territories surrounding France. Cardinal Mazarin succeeded Richelieu as the chief minister for the next king, 4-year-old Louis XIV. The new cardinal strove to raise the money to meet the cost of the 30 Years' War, but he was met with stiff opposition and caused uprisings. Much of the rebellion died away, and leaders came to terms with the government. Royal absolutism was the divine right of a king to rule the people. God had established the royal rulers, providing them with authority and absolute power. People had to obey God's laws, and if the ruler was placed there by God, the people would also have to obey the ruler. That's the idea behind royal absolutism. Louis was a dedicated king and ruled his realm through a personal role in several councils of state. Even though France was experiencing financial difficulties, the king never called an Estates General. The Estates General was the representative form of the French government. And there were 3 estates. You have the nobility, right, the wealthy, you've got the clergy, the religion, and you have the commoners, everybody else. Louis hated division and insisted on religious unity for the security of the state, and so he persuaded the policies of Richelieu and revoked the Edict of Nantes and suppressed the Huguenots, not allowing people to worship how they wanted to. His absolute authority did have some constraints. The king was expected to rule with a consistency reflecting the benevolent authority. Louis was expected to uphold laws issued by his royal predecessors. During the 30 Years' War, the French military became a well-organized fighting unit under Louis XIV. The French army tripled in size and professionalism increased. Thus, developments were part of a European-wide phenomenon called the Military Revolution. Though the French won victories in the 1660s and the 1670s, the War of the 1680s and 90s brought no additional territories and placed unbearable strain on French resources. The absolutist palace. So the French king moved his court and government to the newly renovated palace at Versailles. The location became the central hub of French political, social, and cultural life. An elaborate set of etiquette rules was in place around interactions with the king and royal family. And there's this really great series on Netflix, and it's about Louis. and it may I can't remember what it's called, but just to give you an idea of just like the absurdity of Versailles and these rules and etiquette that they had to follow, you should take the time and watch it. I think it's only like 3 seasons long. It's really good. But the patronage system was maintained from the courts to the provinces, and this is where high-ranked individuals would protect a lower-ranked one in exchange for loyalty and services. Versailles was at the center of European politics, causing French culture to gain international prestige. So, like, playwrights and musicians and actors, they would all, like, you would have someone very wealthy support you and your craft, right? And actually, I'm going to skip over that. We're going to come back to that. But this is a view of the palace and the gardens of Versailles. You can see it was a hunting lodge. And basically, I can't remember. I think it was just like this one little piece was the hunting lodge. And then when they decided to make this like where the king's court would be housed from now on, they added all of this, all these buildings. So back here, I think not even these front halls. I can't remember, and those that know, just bear with me. Pretty sure like this was just the hunting lodge, and then they expanded after that. Let's go back there really quickly and talk about the Austrian Habsburgs. So the Austrian Empire was exhausted from the 30 Years' War. Ferdinand II began to reduce the power of the Bohemian estates, the largely Protestant representative assembly, and confiscated the land holdings of Protestant nobles, giving it to his supporters. With this new set of nobility, the Habsburgs established direct rule over Bohemia. The condition of serfs there worsened and Protestantism was eliminated. Ferdinand III centralized the government and established a standing army, then pushed the Ottomans out of most of Hungary and Transylvania. We do have periodic revolts, though, by Habsburg nobles prevented the full development of absolutism there. So here you can see Austria, right? This is the Austrian Habsburg territory. And then lands taken from the Ottomans to expand their territory. So this all goes together. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So in 1569, the Union of Lublin joined the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to create the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse European states. After vying with Sweden and Russia for territory, it eventually weakened and fell under Russian influence in the 17th century, though. Absolutism isn't going to work out in England. And Queen Elizabeth I of England, she was succeeded by her cousin James Stuart, and he became James I. King James was not interested in royal displays of affection for the people he ruled. Instead, he believed that a monarch had a divine right to authority, and since it came from God, a divine ruler only needed to show reverence to God, not the people. So Puritans and Protestants they are Protestants who believe the Reformation did not go far enough, wanted to purify the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, from Catholic elements. One of the changes Puritans hoped to see was the removal of bishops. King James believed royal monarchy and church leadership had to continue through the political entwinement. Bishops were important supporters of the king, hence why he didn't want to get rid of them. James was succeeded by his son Charles I, who further antagonized the Puritans. Charles married a Catholic and continued to support the elements of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Anglican Church. When the Archbishop imposed new procedures to the church organization in Scotland, Presbyterian Scots rejected them and revolted. Charles I summoned Parliament to finance an army to confront the Scots. The Scots resisted King Charles, and Parliament was not willing to trust the king with an army. The House of Commons passed the Triennial Act, which called Parliament into session every 3 years. The Archbishop Laud was impeached. With the Catholic Irish in revolt and the Scots being confrontational, the king found himself preparing for a war. Parliament prepared for war also, but against the king. The English Civil War saw the king fighting with Parliament. The king suffered numerous losses but refused to admit defeat. He was captured by Oliver Cromwell's forces and was put on trial, convicted, and then executed. And then, as we all know, Oliver Cromwell rose to power and ruled England as a dictatorship. The army that defeated the king controlled the government, and Oliver Cromwell was in control of that army. He ruled through what was known as the Protectorate. Cromwell continued the standing military and enforced a form of martial law. England was divided into 12 districts, each governed by a military leader. Under Cromwell, Christian religious affiliations were allowed to practice except for the Roman Catholic faith. Cromwell associated Catholicism with Ireland and believed the Irish were guilty of sedition and heresy. Cromwell led the military into Ireland and banned Catholicism. Catholic priests were executed and church property was confiscated. These acts were committed by Cromwell, and his forces established a deep resentment and hatred between the Irish and the British. Cromwell's son succeeded him, but he was ineffectual, and it all collapsed under his son. After being under Cromwell's harsh military rule, the English were ready to reestablish the royal family. The British royal family had been in exile, and the Restoration brought them back from France and placed Charles II on the throne. The Parliament established the Test Act, which secured the position of the Anglican Church by denying Catholics, Puritans, and others the right to vote. Charles II, not happy with Parliament, entered into agreements with Louis XIV of France, and the French crown would support Charles financially, where Charles agreed to relax the laws against Catholics. The hope was that England would be converted to the Catholic faith. The secret agreements were leaked, and the English population was furious as an anti-Catholic wave of resentment swept over the country. As James II replaced his brother Charles II on the throne, anti-Catholic fears increased. James appointed Catholics to positions in high places throughout England, which was in violation of the Test Act. James II and his family were forced out of England, and the throne was offered to James's Protestant daughter Mary and her husband Prince William of Orange. The replacement of the King of England was called the Glorious Revolution, because there was no bloodshed, and it also ended divine right monarchy. Now the government would be ruled by both Parliament and the royalty. Once Parliament made the law, the royalty could not suspend the order. Protestants could possess arms, but Catholics could not. Other Catholic freedoms were curbed. Parliament now had the upper hand, but represented only the upper class. The Netherlands had won their independence from Spain. Their independence was recognized in the treaty that ended the 30 Years' War. The Dutch established a republic and rejected the monarchical system of rule. However, an oligarchy of wealthy businessmen handled domestic affairs. Ethical bases in Dutch society included being thrifty, frugal, and tolerant. Jews found a greater level of tolerance in the Netherlands than in most other European states. The Dutch economy became anchored in shipbuilding and maintained low prices to undersell other foreign competition. And they're going to get in on the slave trade. The golden age of the Dutch Republic in the 17th century was based on shipping and efficient government. The establishment of the Dutch East India Company in 1602 led to the Dutch gaining control of the Portuguese spice trade in Southeast Asia. Dutch willingness to use force led to territorial control in what had been formerly Portugal's empire. The Dutch West India Company succeeded in wresting control of the parts of Portuguese Brazil and the Spanish Caribbean and establishing sugar plantations. The Dutch also became major players in the transatlantic slave trade. Here's the Dutch Republic in this area, kind of right there. There we go, the red dot, sorry. Amsterdam, kind of spreading out from there. So, Jamestown, that's going to become the central settlement in the newly established British colony of Virginia, which was organized with the intention of increasing the shareholders' investments. Colonists from the Caribbean island of Barbados moved to the mainland of North America and settled Carolina. Far to the north of Carolina and Virginia, colonists searching for religious and economic liberty settled in the region that they now called New England. Many were Puritans hoping to avoid the Anglican Church. New England colonies included the Plymouth Colony and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Later, disgruntled colonists founded Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Haven. Mid-Atlantic colonies included New York, which was captured from the Dutch, Pennsylvania, a colony organized by Quakers wanting to offer religious tolerance, and Maryland, a colony intended for Catholics who were not welcome in other North American colonies. France has established colonial holdings in the New World also. Their territories identified as New France would later become identified as Canada. The French followed the St. Lawrence Seaway and entered the Great Lakes region to establish trading posts with the native tribes. Spain's control of the Caribbean was eroding, and the French and British seized control of various islands. France is going to end up taking several others away from Spain. Among the British's newly gained territory were Bermuda and Barbados. The Dutch had the colony of New Amsterdam, but lost it to the British, who changed the name to New York. So to give you an idea of where all of this is at, right? So here we have British. Eventually she's going to come up and go around the French, but French have all of this control, and then you can see Spain is still they're starting to lose their hold on this part of the world because they're more worried about putting Indian revolts down in the west. So they are going to lose their East Coast holdings. And it's going to allow the French and the British to come in and take this territory. Mercantilism. So that's a collection of governmental policies for the regulation of economic activities by and for the state. This theory drove the economic policies of most European states. British laws, known as the Navigation Acts, restricted other countries' trading rights with British colonies. Basically, if you're a British colony, you can only trade with Great Britain, the motherland, and you can't buy your product or you can't sell your product to like Spain or France under these Navigation Acts. Some viewed the acts as it ends up like damaging Dutch shipping and commerce, and they view them as a form of economic war. France and Great Britain become rivals in overseas empire building, and the competition between the two European powers would develop into confrontations around the globe. France's defeat during the War of Spanish Succession provided Great Britain with an advantage in establishing a global empire. What about people living beyond the borders, though? We're going to kind of start shifting over, and eventually we're going to move to the Russian Empire. But before we get there, many groups of people lived in the contested frontiers between empires, habitually crisscrossed their borders, or carved out niches within empires. Jews were eager participants in colonial trade and established closely linked mercantile communities scattered across many different empires. Family ties and trust within these minority groups was a tremendous advantage in generating the financial credit and cooperation necessary for international commerce. Now let's talk about Mongol rule in Russia and the rise of Moscow. So the Russians had been under Mongol control since the 13th century and had forced the Slavic states to submit to their rule. They were expected to provide the Mongols with slaves and also riches. Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great, he's going to expand Moscow's control eastward to the Baltic. And he began to gain enough strength to provide the courage to stop the tributes to the Mongol Khan. Ivan declared himself and his successors as autocrats, having their own source of power. His highest-ranking nobles were identified as boyars. Ivan claimed that the right of inheritance of the Byzantine Empire, and since Constantinople was under Turkish control, those Muscovite princes made themselves the heirs of both the emperors and the Orthodox Christian seats of power. Ivan III's marriage to the daughter of the last Byzantine emperor enhanced his claim of inheritance, and Ivan IV was the first to take the title of Tsar. So this is the area that we're talking about, right? Spreading out from Moscow, expansion yellow, expansion dark green, expansion again in the lighter green, and then expansion again, kind of this shared. And the orange, I'm sorry, I missed the red, didn't I? Ivan IV became known as Ivan the Terrible. He took the throne at the age of 3. His mother died when he was 8, and he was forced to endure the cruelty of the boyars. At the age of 16, he pushed aside the boyars and crowned himself Tsar. He defeated the Mongols and added their territory to his empire. After his wife, Anastasia Romanov, died, Ivan moved against those he conceived as his enemies and killed them along with their families. All commoners were now servants of the Tsar. Many peasants fled into the wilds and joined warrior bands, known as Cossacks. Ivan then outlawed the peasants from leaving their masters, and this began the system of serfdom within the Russian state. Ivan began taxing the urban traders and artisans, and the Russian people were then included into the Tsar's service. Ivan even made use of the Cossack army to forge into the southeast. After his death, Russia entered what was called the Time of Troubles. A struggle for power led to Michael Romanov, the grandnephew of Ivan the Terrible, taking the title of Tsar. The Romanov family now had the hereditary right to the Russian royal throne. But we're going to have Peter the Great come in, and he was interested in state building and initiated a campaign to modernize Russia. The Russian leader took a trip to the west, where he was impressed by the abilities of the Dutch and English. After suffering a military defeat against Sweden, Peter began to increase state power and military strength. He sought foreigners who could begin improving the Russian state, and the new military was able to defeat the Swedish army in Ukraine and brought Latvia and Estonia under Russian control. Peter had a desolate Swedish outpost transformed into a new modern city named St. Petersburg, and thousands of peasants were put to work providing free labor for the Tsar. Many of Peter the Great's reforms were unpopular with the Russian population. The Tsar changed the inheritance rights of land to one son alone, cutting off other children from the family property. And here's some different pictures of Peter the Great. So what we see happening in the 17th century is a lot of upheaval, right? And it really represents this difficult passage between 2 centuries of dynamism and growth in Europe. We're going to see, changes in religion and changes in states and even in maps and who has control of what during the 17th century. The 18th century is going to see like these politics that are like this absolutism and monarchy. All these power politics are thrown into question by the Enlightenment and aspirations for human society. And hopefully, if you guys stick around and you take the second half of World Civ, we'll pick up right up talking about the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and how that comes into play and how we start to see things change even more within the 18th century.